For months, a very specific group of media voices had been controlling the story around Shedeur Sanders. The same names, the same criticisms, the same script, recycled week after week across sports radio and digital platforms. And then, in one heated broadcast, Garrett Bush decided enough was enough. What followed wasn't just a disagreement between two people on air. It was a systematic dismantling of a narrative that had been building for months, and the moment fans had been waiting for someone to finally say out loud. To understand why this moment hit so hard, you have to understand what had been happening in the weeks and months leading up to it. Certain commentators, specifically Jason Lloyd and Adam the Bull, had positioned themselves as the loudest, most consistent critics of Shedeur Sanders. Not once, not twice, but on a near-weekly basis, the same talking points kept surfacing. Was Shedeur too confident for his own good? Was he more focused on his brand than on football? Did he have the work ethic to compete at the NFL level? Did he truly have the respect of his teammates? These weren't new questions, and that was exactly the problem. The repetition was relentless. And the way the sports media machine operates, repetition creates perception. When the same criticism gets repeated enough times across enough platforms, it starts sounding like established fact, even when the evidence behind it is thin or completely unverifiable. That's not an accident. That's how narratives get built and sustained. What made the situation even more concerning was the sourcing behind a significant portion of these claims. A major chunk of the criticism directed at Sanders wasn't coming from named, accountable voices. It was sourced from unnamed people. No faces, no names, no accountability. Just sources say and I'm hearing, language that sounds credible in the moment but can never actually be verified or directly challenged. When a claim is made by an anonymous source, there is no one to confront, no one to question, and no one to hold responsible if that claim turns out to be wrong. That double standard, where rumors are treated with the same weight as on-record statements, is precisely what fans eventually started pushing back against. The turning point didn't come from another journalist or media personality. It came from everyday fans calling into sports radio and directly challenging the voices that had been shaping the narrative. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't controlled anymore. Regular people, not analysts, not commentators, started asking the simple, direct questions that nobody in the media seemed prepared to answer with actual facts. The questions were pointed and uncomfortable. If Shedeur Sanders is such a problem in the locker room, why are the players who actually share that locker room with him saying something completely different? Why are respected veterans openly praising his leadership and his presence? Why does the version of Shedeur that exists on sports radio sound nothing like the version described by the people who practice with him every single day? This disconnect is what made people stop and pay attention. And the callers didn't let up. One after another, they brought real examples, real names, and real statements from people with genuine access to the Cleveland Browns organization, none of which matched the negative narrative being pushed on air. The contrast was impossible to ignore once it was laid out side by side. Then came a moment that became symbolic of everything wrong with the conversation up to that point. Jason Lloyd was directly pressed by a caller who wanted a straight answer. What followed were awkward pauses, deflection, and the infamous invocation of the Fifth Amendment, delivered as a joke, but revealing all the same. When you cannot answer a direct challenge with facts, that moment speaks for itself. It did not go unnoticed. The most powerful counter-evidence fans were pointing to wasn't a statistic or a highlight reel. It was the voices coming from inside the Browns organization, the players who are actually in the building every day, the ones who see everything that happens behind closed doors. Myles Garrett is the starting point here, and his voice carries enormous weight. Myles Garrett is not a fringe voice or a teammate trying to be diplomatically supportive. He is widely considered one of the most respected and dominant players in the entire NFL. When Garrett speaks publicly about what he observes in the locker room, people across the league take notice. He had spoken openly about the confidence and the presence that Shedeur Sanders brings to the team environment. That is not a throwaway comment made in a post-practice press scrum. That is a serious, deliberate endorsement from a player who has earned the right to be taken seriously on every subject he addresses. Then there is Denzel Ward, another key leader within the Browns organization. Ward had also spoken positively about Sanders, about the energy he brings to practice, and the attitude he carries into team meetings. Again, this is not a random voice offering a generic compliment. This is a player who sees everything that happens inside the building and chose to go on record with a positive assessment. The question that Garrett Bush and the fans calling in kept returning to was the same: if the established story about Shedeur Sanders is that he is a locker room problem, how do you reconcile that with two of the locker room's most respected leaders saying the exact opposite? That is not a coincidence or a PR move. That is the actual people with actual access telling you what they see. And the media voices pushing the negative narrative were choosing to bypass those statements in favor of anonymous tips. This is where everything came to a head. Garrett Bush didn't ease into the conversation. He went straight at the core problem, the constant, calculated shifting of the argument every time new evidence emerged to contradict the existing narrative. And once he laid out the pattern clearly, it was difficult to look away from. The cycle had been playing out in plain sight. The first wave of criticism said Shedeur Sanders didn't have the locker room's respect. Then Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward went on record with positive statements. Instead of updating the evaluation, the argument simply shifted: those players are just being good teammates. It doesn't really mean anything. The second wave of criticism said Sanders wasn't showing the right level of engagement in team settings. Then footage began circulating showing him already sitting in the front row during team meetings, the exact behavior critics had said he wasn't demonstrating. The argument shifted again: well, that's just one clip. The third wave of criticism claimed that outside analysts weren't seeing the development either. Then Hall of Fame quarterback Kurt Warner sat down, broke down Shedeur's film in detail, and came away praising his football IQ, his mechanics, and his decision-making. The argument shifted once more: Warner isn't in the building every day, so his opinion doesn't really count. Garrett Bush called this out with precision and force: if positive evaluations are always dismissed and negative rumors are always amplified, then the evaluation was never really about football in the first place. That was the line that cut through everything. It reframed the entire conversation, not as a debate about a quarterback's readiness, but as a question about whether the conversation had ever been conducted in good faith. The energy in that broadcast wasn't calm or academic. Bush was visibly fired up, and for good reason. He wasn't performing outrage. He was responding to a months-long pattern that he had watched play out and was no longer willing to let pass without challenge. Chase Daniel, a former NFL quarterback, had also entered the conversation in a meaningful way. Daniel had specifically gone back and broken down Shedeur's film to address the criticisms that had been circulating. His analysis highlighted how Sanders correctly read defenses against the Buffalo Bills, diagnosing pre-snap looks the way an experienced quarterback does at the professional level. That kind of evaluation, coming from an actual quarterback who played in this league, carries different weight than a take generated for radio content. Bush made sure that distinction was front and center in the conversation. The Rex Ryan example deserves its own examination because it perfectly illustrates how the narrative around Shedeur Sanders was being constructed and sustained. Ryan had suggested publicly that Shedeur Sanders needed to sit closer to the front during team meetings, presenting it as a legitimate inside critique about leadership, focus, and engagement. It spread quickly because it sounded specific and credible. It had the texture of real insider information. Then the footage came out. Video clips began circulating online showing Shedeur Sanders already sitting in the front row during those exact team meetings. Not in the middle. Not in the back. The front row, the precise location critics had said he needed to be in. The reaction was immediate and it wasn't subtle. It wasn't just surprise. It triggered a full-scale reconsideration of how many other criticisms had the same foundation, or complete lack of one. Because if a criticism that specific could be that wrong, and if it could spread that far and that fast before being corrected, then the same question had to be applied to every other claim that had been made over the previous months. That is the moment the audience shifted. Fans stopped asking, "Is Shedeur Sanders ready?" and started asking how many of these stories were ever based on actual, verified information. Once you stop accepting the premise and start examining the sourcing, the entire narrative looks fundamentally different. That shift in the question is not a small thing. That is everything. Garrett Bush was pointing toward something bigger than one radio segment or one quarterback. Shedeur Sanders entered this situation carrying a massive spotlight before he ever took a single professional snap. His name, his father's legacy, Coach Deion Sanders, his confidence, his social media presence, all of it made him a natural focal point for both intense support and intense criticism. In that environment, narratives form fast. And once a narrative forms, it takes on a life of its own. Every ambiguous moment gets filtered through the pre-existing story. If the story is not ready, then every unclear situation becomes confirmation of that, regardless of what the actual evidence shows. This is how perception replaces fact in sports media, and it happens at scale across platforms and broadcast hours without anyone formally deciding it should work that way. What Garrett Bush did, and what the fans calling in had already been doing for weeks, was force the conversation back to actual evidence. Actual names. Actual footage. Actual statements from people with genuine first-hand access. That is not a complicated standard to apply. It is, in fact, the minimum standard any serious evaluation should meet. The incentive structure of sports media rewards controversy over accuracy. Heated takes generate clicks. Arguments generate ratings. The more volatile the narrative, the more attention it receives. That does not mean every journalist pushing a critical story has bad intentions, but it does mean the ecosystem creates pressure toward a certain kind of storytelling, whether it is fully grounded or not. And when that dynamic runs unchecked, the version of an athlete that exists in the media can become completely disconnected from the version that exists in reality. That is exactly why moments like the one Garrett Bush created matter. When fans push back with evidence, and when someone refuses to let contradictions quietly disappear from the conversation, it creates a different kind of accountability that does not usually exist in real time. The conversation around Shedeur Sanders has fundamentally shifted. It is no longer one-sided. Fans are no longer absorbing whatever the loudest voices on sports radio put forward, they are comparing it directly against what players are saying, what film actually shows, and what the evidence actually supports. Myles Garrett has spoken positively about him. Denzel Ward has spoken positively about him. Kurt Warner evaluated his game film and came away genuinely impressed. Chase Daniel broke down actual plays from actual games and defended his football IQ in concrete terms. The footage contradicted several of the specific criticisms that circulated for months as though they were established fact. That does not mean Shedeur Sanders is beyond scrutiny. Every quarterback in the NFL gets evaluated hard, and that is exactly how it should be. Scrutiny is a legitimate part of professional football. But scrutiny is supposed to be rooted in verifiable facts, not anonymous sources, not assumptions about a player's character, not criticisms that footage immediately and directly contradicts. The standard has to be consistent, and for months it was not. Garrett Bush said clearly what a significant number of people had already been thinking. And the fact that it resonated so powerfully across social media tells you something concrete about how fans are consuming sports media right now. People are watching more closely. They are comparing more carefully. They are asking harder, more specific questions. The audience has changed, and the media landscape around the NFL is slowly being forced to adjust to that reality. As Shedeur Sanders moves deeper into his career in the league, every moment on the field will be examined. That is the reality of playing professional football with this level of public attention. But the conversation around him is now being shaped by more than a handful of media voices operating on anonymous sources. Fans are in the conversation. Former players with real NFL experience are weighing in with detailed film breakdowns. And people like Garrett Bush are making sure the contradictions do not quietly disappear the way they might have in a previous era of sports media. The story is not finished. It is just getting started. And the standard being applied to it now is a much higher one than what was being applied before. If you have been watching this situation unfold and you believe Shedeur Sanders deserves a fair evaluation grounded in actual evidence, hit that like button right now and make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Every update, every breakdown, every moment the mainstream narrative misses, we cover it right here. Turn on notifications so you do not miss what happens next, because this story is far from over.